Highlighting the history of our nation's past creates learning opportunities and gives chances to bring to light past experiences, essential landmarks, and promotes growth within our society. The Macedonia African Methodist Cemetery, located in Johns Creek, Georgia, is home to over 100 burials, including former enslaved African Americans. It serves an essential role in retelling the story of the period after the Civil War. We start with the end to the raging American Civil War in April of 1865, with General Robert E. Lee's surrender on behalf of the Confederacy. But the Union did not neatly piece itself back together. According to Dr. Kenja McCray, Associate Professor of History at Atlanta Metropolitan State College and Visiting Professor of History at Georgia Tech, the city of Atlanta and the area was devastated. Thousands of acres of farmland had been destroyed. Factories were destroyed. Railroads pulled up and twisted. African American and white American homes were destroyed. Plantations were destroyed, including quarters for African American slaves. There was hunger, no way to make a living, even for people trying to make a way of life. But amidst the chaos, President Lincoln presented a plan for Reconstruction to bring the Southern states back into the Union, starting with Congress, to ratify 3 amendments to the Constitution. Johnson's presidency set the stage for Southern opposition to Reconstruction to grow and gain momentum. This drawing was a representation of the scales of justice tipping in the South's favor, after Johnson chose to veto a bill that would fund the military control of the South, and the primary target of the Southerners' hate was African Americans. White Southerners partook in lynching of black men and even teenagers who were accused of crimes but never had access to fair trial. Some even contended that these conditions were worse than slavery.
So there was a lot of hunger, there was a lot of homelessness, people were without a way to make a living, feed their families, and so they're trying to make a way.
The South was still a heavily agrarian society, and this led to sharecropping and tenant farming. In these practices, landowners, who were mostly white, would lend housing, tools, seeds, and land to African Americans in exchange for a share of their crops at harvest time. The 13th Amendment abolished most forms of slavery and declared that owning slaves was a crime punishable by the law. The 14th Amendment established due process and granted citizenship to all people born or naturalized in the United States. This amendment overturned the decision of the Supreme Court in the landmark Dred Scott case, which denied U.S. citizenship to all people of African descent. The 15th Amendment extended voting rights to all men, including the newly emancipated former slaves. These developments pushed white supremacists and the Ku Klux Klan to find alternative ways of bypassing the law and keeping African Americans marginalized.
Minstrels were white, usually males, who would dress up and paint their faces black and draw on big red lips to caricature African Americans, and they would do things in a very exaggerated, often degrading manner that were supposed to be imitating African Americans. So the era was named after this practice. If it was difficult for you to get a job, right? You had been enslaved and now you're looking for a job, it becomes illegal to not have a job. And once a person was arrested, they might be arrested and fined. If they couldn't pay the fine, well, how could you pay the fine? You hadn't been paid, you didn't get any back pay for all the labor you had done, right? Then you could essentially be sold to the highest bidder.
After a significant win for the African American rights, the South had found a way through the legislature to reverse all these gains and marginalize the people and keep them from exercising their full citizenship rights. This new condition pushed the rise of a new movement. In the 1880s, institutions of the South were created to educate and support African American communities. This new condition pushed the rise of a new movement. In the 1880s, institutions in the South were created to educate and support African American communities.
Most African Americans, because of the legacy of slavery, because of Jim Crow, are very, very economically disadvantaged at the time. African Americans are being disenfranchised, they're kept from voting at the time, facing tremendous odds, but at the same time, they're institution building. So they're building churches like Macedonia Church. The African American community is very interested in institution building in this way. During the Progressive Era and during Reconstruction, they were very interested in getting educated. So I listed some colleges. Morehouse College was formed during Reconstruction, Spelman College.
After Reconstruction ended, the United States experienced a second industrial revolution and a progressive era during the late 1800s and early 1900s. During this time, activists like Ida B. Wells tried to expose the discrimination and violence that African Americans faced in the North and the South. America's involvement in World War I in 1917 brought an unprecedented change in the industrial regions of the North, Midwest, and West. Because many working men, including African American soldiers, had left to fight the war in Europe, industrial efforts, crucial to producing weapons and necessary war supplies, were suffering from a significant labor shortage. These regions then turned their gaze to the South, where the number of laborers was abundant. Many companies got African Americans from the South to work in their factories, with promises of better working and living conditions in the North. This caused the era known as the Great Migration. Population in cities like Chicago, Detroit, and Pittsburgh snowballed as many African Americans looking for a new place to work and to escape racial violence and discrimination in the South left in search of greater, greener pastures. This is where a common misconception about racism in the United States is addressed. African Americans migrated outside the South. These new places in the North were not completely devoid of racism. We see a new form of racism outside the South in the Great Migration era, written in social custom rather than in law.
But African Americans who went north may face overcrowding in certain areas that were designated, socially for African Americans only, and other places for whites only, right? And other places where the Jewish section of town, right? The Irish lived over here, right? And a lot of that segregation was what we would call de facto. It was just a matter of fact. It was a social custom. So in certain ways, that was a harder kind of oppression. That was a harder obstacle to face because it was really fleeting. It was often hard to prove. It wasn't written in black and white like Southern ordinances.
Conditions like these brought out the importance of Black institutions to provide support and protection from racial violence and discrimination. Many people started new lives away from their family and familiar homes, in places in the North that still saw them as the other. When African Americans who moved north returned to the South, institutions like Macedonia gave the African American community a sense of comfort and support that pushed them through the new set of struggles when they were away from home.
The importance of a cemetery like Macedonia is to memorialize ordinary people. And if we really believe that our lives matter, my life matters, your lives matter, everybody's life matters, then we would understand the importance of memorializing everyday people as well and preserving their memories.
Today, the Macedonia Cemetery serves as a foothold to all of the past, creating a look at how the grim world around affected a local American community amid Reconstruction, the Progressive Era, and the Great Migration. The cemetery also allows us to preserve the souls and memories of those who once lived here.